Matt Reeves' The Batman is the latest feature film adaptation of the titular DC Comics icon. This time played by Robert Pattinson, this is the third version of the character to be put on the big screen in the last 10 years, not to mention the various other iterations seen in video games, animations, and of course comic books. This all begs the question, what ground is there actually left to cover with such an exhaustively overused character, especially considering the film's generously lengthy runtime? It turns out actually quite a lot. Reeves' adaptation of the Caped Crusader dissects the character to an extent not previously seen on screen. Earlier Batman films have touched on the idea that the vigilante may actually perpetuate the vicious cycle of crime than do anything productive to stop it, but this critical view is front and centre in this film. 2 years into his one-man war on crime, and violence not only continues to plague Gotham, but has escalated and the scale of the criminal threat has grown. This more contemporary, almost condemning approach to this version of the character was fresh and made for incredibly interesting viewing, as we're never quite sure where the story is going, how dark it's going to get, and how the characters will respond to actions thrown their way. Through this more critical lens, Pattinson's Bruce Wayne feels perhaps more real than his predecessors. Throughout the film, you are reminded that this is an unstable person whose seething rage is barely contained and is unable to maintain any ordinary relationships. So much so that the playboy philanthropist alter ego which plays such a prominent role in more traditional versions of the character is virtually completely absent here, and is instead replaced by a social outcast who struggles to maintain any sort of relationship to anyone aside from Alfred, Gordon, and later in the film Catwoman. Of this, I was intrigued by Andy Serkis's version of Alfred, but found myself wanting him to have a larger role in the film. Perhaps I've been spoiled by Michael Caine, who became an integral part of the Dark Knight trilogy. Indeed, earlier versions of Alfred were very much a side character only, but I wanted to see more of this version of Bruce's dynamic with his butler. They shared some great scenes together, but ultimately were not terribly important to the main story in the film. However, Batman's relationship with Gordon in this film was excellent. I dare say Jeffrey Wright may be my favourite version of the Commissioner yet. He and Batman were truly partners and worked together to track down the Riddler. And some of these sequences which focused on this duo conducting actual detective work, and seeing how Batman worked within the police system rather than on its fringes, was again interesting to see on the big screen. It suited the slower, more noirish tone of the film. That's not to say the film didn't feature some great action sequences as well. The Batmobile chase in the middle of the film was incredibly gritty and tense and had me on the edge of my seat. Some of the set pieces were really well thought through and kinetic, and shot and edited beautifully. Structurally, a lot of this film worked really well for me, but it would be remiss of me if I didn't say that the final act left me a touch underwhelmed. Without trying to delve too deep into spoilers, I felt that the Riddler's final threat came somewhat out of the blue. To make an obvious comparison, Batman Begins set up the Wayne monorail as the final set piece through explaining its origins and featuring it throughout the film. The seawall as a set piece in this film felt as though it came from nowhere, and the extent of the destruction was never made particularly explicit. I also found the final showdown to be a little underwhelming, as the Riddler's acolytes had not appeared prior to this, and I think the confrontation would have had more impact if the Riddler was actually involved somehow. But that said, Paul Dano's Riddler was legitimately unsettling, and he played the part to perfection throughout. The confrontation between him and Batman at Arkham before the final showdown was possibly my favourite scene in the film. Other members of the cast, like Zoe Kravitz's Catwoman, Colin Farrell's Penguin, and John Turturro's Falcone, were similarly strong and perfectly cast. Kravitz in particular was a standout, and played Selina Kyle with great empathy. Another character in the film was the city of Gotham itself. Despite the story and the characters being possibly the most grounded adaptation yet, the city felt as though it was ripped straight from a comic book, and I loved it. As expected, I adore Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, and I think those films do a good job of situating the mythos in our world, but Reeves's world is very clearly not our own. The truly gothic sprawl of a city is so fascinating on screen, and like nowhere in our own world. Seeing that sort of architecture in a modern American society felt much closer to a contemporary revision of Tim Burton's Gotham City than the more grounded Nolan world. The way this world was photographed too was unlike anything I've seen in a big blockbuster film before. Greg Fraser is quickly becoming one of my favourite cinematographers working on large-scale films today, as his work always feels so personal and well-tailored. Here, the use of prototype Arri Alpha anamorphic lenses created a bizarre aberration, and softened the edges of every frame, creating a truly unique, vintage, hazy look for this Gotham. Michael Giacchino's soundtrack was flawless as ever, and his new theme for Batman has become instantly iconic. If you're a fan of these characters in this world, there is very little to dislike about the Batman. Part of the reason these characters in this world have endured so long is the fact that they are so adaptable and able to be reinvented to suit a contemporary audience. This film is less shapely than its predecessors and much more critical of the character, which I think people will find more resonant than some other versions. I recommend it strongly, with the caveat that I did find a couple of shortcomings, particularly pertaining to the film's final act, which may indeed iron out on repeat viewings and with the context of inevitable sequel story beats. What did you think of The Batman? Did you enjoy this take on the character, or is there something else you'd have preferred the filmmakers and the studio to do with the mythos? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please feel free to leave a comment below. If you've enjoyed this review, please consider subscribing for more. Until next time, thanks.